Okay, before doing the installation on the MGW shifter, the first thing you want to do is just make sure that the car is in neutral and on a flat surface. We're actually on a lift right now because we're going to be performing on a lift, but it can be done on jack stands. So put the transmission in neutral and make sure that you set the emergency brake so the car can't go anywhere. Okay, the first step is to remove the factory shifter. And the first step in doing that is let's get the factory knob off. Now if you have a upgraded GT interior, you may have one of the little aluminum billet shift balls or one of the plastic shift balls like on the Boss 302. Those are actually blue Loctited because it's not a plastic knob thread. So you may have to slightly heat up with a hairdryer or something, or get a leather strap wrench to remove the shift knob. They can be very tight, but they will come off. Alright, once the shift knob is removed, you just pull slightly up on the boot. Then you want to come back and you want to open the center glove box and go ahead and open your cup holder. The console basically just tilts up from the back. There are no bolts or screws or fasteners you need to worry about. All you want to do is carefully get your fingers up underneath this ridge on the back of the console and lift up very smoothly inside. Careful not to put a lot of pressure on the cup holder area. You don't want to break the lid. If you feel a little nervous doing that, just take a little spatula or flat blade screwdriver and you can pry up the back enough to get your hands up in there. You just want to carefully lift it up, work your way to the front. There's a couple little clips right there in the middle. And you pop that up out of the way. Then in the very front, there's two more. Now there's two posts that go in the very front, here and here. So when you get to this point, and I always put it back into fourth gear just to have the shaft angled backwards, you want to just carefully pull back, lift the boot off of the shaft, but don't pull it up too far because there's one connector. And if you can see up in there like that, I don't know if you can see that well, but there's one connector. It just has a little push-in post there. You push that in, and it just pulls right out. Once that's done, the console is completely removed, and you can set it off to the side. Okay, once you get the console off, pop the shifter back into neutral. Make sure it's in neutral. Now we want to get all this sound pads and the wire connectors out of the way. First thing you want to do is just take this one connector and just tug on it lightly, and you will pull it out of the little hole right there. It's just got one of those little plastic push-in connectors. And then it's also held down right here on one of these studs with a little plastic connector. Just wiggle it and it'll pop right up, and then you can just pull this back and out of the way. Then you just want to grab this sound pad, work it out from around the shifter like this. Now this little connector here actually has a Torx nut on it, but it actually doesn't hold very tightly. I just go ahead and pop it up off there. If you just wiggle it and pop it off, it comes right off. You don't have to turn it. Once you get that off, you just work the pad off of those studs and pull it up out of the way. Then we want to remove the factory dust boot, and this dust boot will not be used on our shifter. We have our own custom-made dust boot, so you just want to remove it, and you can set it aside with all of the OEM pieces. Just work it out of the outside oval and then just lift it up, and now the shifter is exposed. Okay, once we have the shift boot removed from the shifter to expose the shifter base, we want to remove the 3/4 20 screws from the base, and they have a 3/8 head on them, so you need a 3/8 socket, and I use an extension of about 6-8 inches just to make it easy to remove. Now you're only going to be able to get 3 of these screws out right now. The one right here in the lower right hand corner, we will have to lower the back of the shifter by removing the rear shifter bracket and get to that one, but we'll go ahead and remove these before we lift the vehicle. To access that last bolt up top and also to remove the shifter, we need to go ahead and take the rear support bracket off now. It is attached with two 6mm hex nuts. They have a 10mm hex size, and you have to use a deep well 10mm hex socket because the studs, as you can see, stick down pretty far. So if you use a standard socket, you won't be able to reach those hex nuts. So use a 10mm deep well socket. And we just want to go up here and remove both of these. Once those two hex nuts are removed, you want to pull down on this rear bracket to pull it off of the stud so you can take it off of the rear shifter. Now for assembly, Ford puts a panel nut on either the left or right side just to hold it in place. So when you pull down on it, you really need to kind of get your finger up in there and pull down on that panel nut also, or it will fight with you when you're trying to remove that bracket. And once it slides down, just peel it off the back of the shift bracket and pull it down. And you can see here's the panel nut I'm talking about. It's just used to hold it in place, so if you pull down too hard on it, it'll kind of bind, so just pull down on this. Now back inside the car, once we have removed the rear support bracket where we can lower the shifter a little bit, we can access that one hex nut that's hidden in there, and you can kind of manipulate the shifter a little bit. It does require a little bit of dexterity to get to it, but once you get it loose, it's pretty easy to remove. Now when you remove this last nut, don't be alarmed. The shifter will probably just pop right off in your hand. That's what we want it to do. And if that bolt falls on the ground, you can just retrieve it later. Okay. And that's all there is to it to remove the upper shift assembly. Now, one thing we are reusing, so make sure you don't discard it, is the pivot cup that's on the bottom of that shifter. So we will remove that in a few minutes and attach it to the MGW shifter. You do not need any of the bolts or anything. Once we get the upper shifter out of place, we want to peel off this thin little rubber gasket so that we can remove the bushings. Once that gasket's removed, you'll see it has two little plastic support brackets. These are the ones that retain the bushings that are inside the OEM unit. Now you can either just pull up in the center on the shaft and that'll pull up the bracket. You can remove that one, pull up a little bit on the front, and you should be able to remove this one. Now if it feels like it's sticking, that's only because there's a little rubber dust boot in the front, and you can pull it up out of the way. We may do that when we're down removing the rear bracket. It's a little easier, but you can access it from the top as well. Just pull that up out of the way, and then this bracket will slide right out. Okay. Once these retainer brackets are out, then the selector arm actually just comes right up out of it. Now you can either leave that stuff on there for right now, or you can pull these bushings off. I'm going to choose just to leave them there. We'll pull them off from the underside of the vehicle after we disconnect the lower shifter assembly. The next step is actually removing the support arm from the assembly so we can remove the lower base assembly from the car. We decided to show this on a bench top because it's a lot clearer and you can see a lot better how to do this operation. The swing arm is held onto the lower base assembly with these three hex head bolts. These have a 3/8 diameter hex head on them. They're 1/4 bolts. So you just want to take a 3/8 socket and remove these three bolts. Okay, once we have removed the lower base assembly, this will be your selector arm exposed, and you'll see that it has the two bushings on the rod. The one on the end you can just slide off. The other one is actually split, so you just spread it apart and slide it off and get it out of the way. Now I'm going to show this assembly also outside of the car because it's a lot easier to explain how this thing is assembled. Before we even attach this box to the swing arm that we removed, we want to assemble it and close it up together onto the transmission selector arm first. It's very easy to do. The first thing is you want to get the 2 red bushings out. Now keep in mind they'll be lathered in that green grease to lubricate them. Try not to wipe that grease off. I know it'll get messy, but keep as much on the inside of the bushing as you can. You'll note that one of the bushings is split, one of them is solid. The split one you'll put on just like you took off the factory one. You'll just spread it apart and it'll snap onto the front. The other one you can just slide on and put your finger over top of it so that the grease stays inside it and doesn't just ooze out the back, and then you just want to slide it there. Next, you want to just take the bolts off because the box will actually become assembled the way you see it here. You just unscrew the bolts and you'll remove it, and it's like a clamshell. You just remove the 2 halves. This is your top half, the part you can see through. And you can see it has the dust boot just like the factory unit has. That's for that little dust boot in the front. When we get this thing clamped together, it'll make a perfect circle, and you will spread the dust boot around and seal that area up. So from underneath the car, you will just grab this, and obviously the cup will be facing the roof of the car, facing upwards. So this will actually go on top of it like this. But for our purposes, we're going to flip this thing upside down just so you can see how it goes in. Just keep in mind that this is actually pointing to the top of the car, not to the ground. So you'll just line up the red bushings inside the slots, and it'll sit in there just like that. And then you will just take the other piece and make sure that you have it so that all the screws are facing the same way and everything lines up. You have a bevel here that lines up, and then you obviously, like I was talking about, you have your dust boot that now makes a perfect circle and a rim for your dust boot. Once that's clamped in together, you just hold it with your fingers tight and you just work your 4 bolts in. And you just want to get them snug. You don't want to get them super tight. You just want to get them snug at this point. Now, like I said, we do have blue Loctite. If you prefer, you can put a little dab of blue Loctite on these bolts, but they are not necessary as long as you get on them nice and tight when you're tightening up everything completely. And that's it. That will be assembled like this, and again, it will actually be oriented like this, and that's what you'll see in the cockpit of your car when you're going to install the top shifter assembly. This will be to the driver's side, and that is to the front of the vehicle. Okay, once we have the lower base assembly assembled, clamping the selector arm, we're ready to go ahead and mount the swing arm side support that mounts the transmission to the box. And MGW goes ahead and puts in 3 studs rather than having 4 threaded holes. That way it's a lot easier to mount it instead of trying to fumble with all the screws going into the holes. So all you basically have to do is line up the 2 front holes and the one in the middle in the slot, slide the swing arm in place, put your 3 lock washers in. These are 1/4-inch lock washers. And put your 1/4-20 armor coated hex nuts on. And they use a 7/16 socket, a little bit larger than the heads of the factory OEM bolts. And here again, you might want to put a little blue Loctite on these because these aren't very large studs, and you do not want to clamp on these nuts very tightly or you will strip that. It's only a 1/4-inch stud on there, so put a little blue Loctite on them and just grip it until it firmly compresses the lock washer and you're good to go. Now, until we get this final bolt on, you just want to start these and get them all turned down hand tight. You do not want to tighten them right now. Once they are in place, you take the 5/16 18 armor coated bolt, put the lock washer on it and put a little blue Loctite on it as well, and we machine a little starter angle so that you can find that hole pretty easily. And that has to be tightened using a 1/2-inch socket. So you can go ahead and get it tightened all the way down since the other nuts are already started. And you can get on this one pretty tightly because it's a much larger bolt. But once it's firmly tight, go back, tighten these up with your 7/16 socket. But again, do not get ridiculously tight on them or you will strip or even shear those studs off. Just use wrist pressure here and let the Loctite do its work. Okay, once that assembly is tight, then from the bottom of the car, you obviously want to go ahead and fully seat with your 1/2-inch socket again. And